I love the Appalachian Mountains and the region around it. It's so beautiful, it's so peaceful and eerie, and just everything I love about nature. Guys, personally, I'm from North Carolina, so I grew up around the Appalachian Mountains. I'm in Western North Carolina, and I love this region so much. But there are so many horror stories, freaky stuff, sightings, weird mysteries that happened in this region, and I wanted to put it all into a video, so let's get into the horrors of the Appalachian Mountains. Be sure to subscribe if you want more videos like this, or follow if you're on Spotify. I've done the horrors of the deep ocean, the horrors of Yosemite National Park. I love these kinds of videos, so there's gonna be a lot more in the future. Also, I have an Instagram where you can, follow me. And then I have a Discord where we can hang out and talk and stuff, so join that if you're interested. But let's get into this. The Appalachian Mountains run along the eastern side of North America, stretching roughly 1,500 miles from Newfoundland in Canada down to central Alabama in the United States. They pass through states like Maine, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Major subranges include the Blue Ridge, which is where I am. Other subranges include the Great Smoky Mountains and the Alleghenies. The Appalachian Trail alone cuts through 14 states, crossing into some of the most remote terrain in the US. Geologically, these mountains are very, very old. They're ancient. They're over 480 million years old. They formed during a series of continental collisions long before the Atlantic Ocean even existed in its current shape. At one point, they were likely comparable in height to today's major mountain systems. Hundreds of millions of years of erosion wore them down into long ridgelines and rounded peaks. And that amount of age and amount of time really matters because it created a landscape full of deep forests, extensive cave systems, sinkholes, and complicated underground geology. It's a very old, very ancient piece of land that has a lot of personality because of how old it is. It had enough time to gain that personality. The region, commonly referred to as Appalachia in general, covers parts of 13 states, and it has its own cultural identity. Isolation shaped much of its history. Many communities developed in narrow valleys, often called hollers, separated by steep ridges. For generations, travel between towns could take hours. Coal mining, logging, and railroad expansion brought economic growth, but also left behind abandoned infrastructure. Also stripped hillsides and environmental damage, and that all still affects parts of the region today. Now I'm gonna glaze the Appalachian Mountains some more. Environmentally, the Appalachians contain some of the most biodiverse temperate forests in the world. Dense canopy cover can block out sunlight, fog settles low in valleys, especially in areas like the Great Smoky Mountains. Wildlife is active and visible: black bears, coyotes, bobcats, wild boar. In certain areas, cell service disappears quickly once you leave main roads. A person can step off trail and lose their bearings within minutes. And all of that comes together to create this setting of the Appalachian Mountains. Such great history, both geologically and culturally, in this area. I love it so much, and let's get into the horrors of it. I'm so excited. The 1996 Shenandoah murders. In May of 1996, Julianne, or Julie Williams, and Laura, or Lolly Winans, traveled to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia for what was supposed to be a normal backcountry hiking trip. Julie was 24, Lolly was 26. They were experienced outdoors women. Lolly had worked as a wilderness guide in the past. This wasn't two people wandering into terrain they didn't understand. They brought Lolly's golden retriever, Taj, and planned to camp along trails near the Skyland area of the park. Shenandoah isn't a forgotten wilderness. It runs along the Blue Ridge Mountains, follows Skyline Drive, and sees heavy traffic, especially in late spring. The Skyland section in particular is one of the more developed parts of the park. There are lodges, maintained trails, and steady foot traffic during peak season. That context matters because this really wasn't an isolated, unreachable stretch of land. It was a national park people felt safe bringing, whole families and kids into. The two women were last confirmed seen on May 24th, 1996. After that, there were no verified sightings. When they failed to return or make contact, concern grew. Their vehicle was later located at a trailhead area inside the park. At some point, Taj, the dog, was found alive without them. He had not simply wandered home with them trailing behind. No, he was completely alone. Search efforts began. Shenandoah is dense in places. Trails weave into wooded slopes and hollows. Even with marked paths, visibility changes quickly depending on weather or foliage. On June 1st, 1996, roughly a week after they were last seen, their bodies were discovered at a backcountry campsite near the Bridle Trail in the Skyland area. This is where it gets bad. It was immediately clear that this wasn't any kind of accident or a case of hikers getting lost. Both women had been bound. They had been sexually assaulted. They had been shot. The crime occurred at their campsite. There were no signs they had managed to escape or signal for help. Because the murders occurred on federal land, the FBI joined the National Park Service in the investigation. Early on, investigators had to consider the nature of the setting. A national park is public, transient, constantly shifting. Visitors move through daily. Campers arrive and leave. Someone could commit a crime and exit the area within hours, blending back into normal traffic along Skyline Drive. Biological evidence was collected, including semen samples that allowed investigators to develop a DNA profile of an unknown male suspect. In 1996, DNA technology existed, but was far less powerful than it is today. CODIS was still expanding and forensic genealogy wasn't yet a real thing. Investigators had a profile, but no match. The case quickly became one of the most disturbing crimes in the park's history. It also raised difficult questions about motive. Williams and Winans were a couple in 1996. Some community members and advocates questioned whether the crime may have been motivated by anti-LGBTQ bias. Law enforcement never publicly confirmed a hate crime classification, largely because there was no direct evidence establishing motive beyond the violence itself. But the possibility lingered in public conversation for years. Other theories circulated as well. Some speculated that the attack was opportunistic, a predator moving through the park who just encountered the women by chance. Others wondered whether it could be connected to other unsolved crimes in Virginia, including comparisons in media coverage to the Colonial Parkway murders from the late 1980s. Law enforcement did not formally link the cases, but the geographic proximity kept the comparison alive. For years, the case stalled in public view. Investigators preserved the DNA evidence, tips came in, suspects were considered and eliminated, but there was no arrest. No public breakthrough, just two women who went on a hiking trip in a well-visited national park and were killed at their own campsite. By the end of the 1990s, the essential facts were that the crime was deliberate, sexually violent, and committed by a man whose DNA didn't match anybody in the federal database. Now, the DNA profile that the investigators had been able to develop from the crime scene was entered into CODIS, which is the national DNA database used by law enforcement. And over the years, as the database expanded and new offenders were added, the profile was routinely compared, but it never matched anyone. There were suspect leads. At different points, people publicly speculated about possible links to other violent offenders in Virginia. One name that surfaced in online discussions years later was Richard Evidence, a serial killer active in Virginia in the late 1990s. Law enforcement eventually ruled him out, though, through DNA testing. Other individuals were investigated and cleared. None matched the profile recovered from the scene. As forensic science advanced in the 2000s and 2010s, especially with the rise of forensic genealogy, older cases across the country began to reopen. Investigators could now upload crime scene DNA profiles to genealogical databases that contained voluntarily submitted consumer DNA data. Instead of waiting for a direct match to a convicted offender, they could identify distant relatives and build family trees backward. The FBI revisited the Shenandoah case using those newer techniques. In 2024, the FBI announced they had identified the killer as Walter Leo Jackson Sr. Jackson had died in 2018. He was 69 years old at the time of his death. According to the FBI, Jackson's DNA was matched to the profile recovered from the crime scene using forensic genealogy and confirmatory testing. He had a history of violent crime. In 1989, he had been convicted of abduction with intent to defile in Culpeper County, Virginia. He had served time in prison and was later released. His background included sexual violence, which aligned with the nature of the Shenandoah murders. Jackson had not been publicly identified as a suspect during the original investigation. There's no indication he was arrested or formally charged in relation to those murders while he was alive. Because he died in 2018, the case didn't proceed to trial, and the FBI formally closed it in 2024. At least this case was solved and the families have some closure, but for me, this one in particular brings up a question of the justice system, because this guy had been arrested and convicted for sexual violence and abduction with intent to defile. It seems like we should have known this was coming, and if we had done something more about it, then these two women might still be alive today. But I don't know, maybe we'll never know. The 1981 Appalachian Trail murders. In May 1981, two young hikers, Laura Susan Susu Ramsey and Robert Mountford Jr., were camping along the Appalachian Trail in southwest Virginia. They were in the Giles County area near Wapiti Shelter along Dismal Creek, a section of the trail that runs through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Appalachian Trail in that region includes established shelters and campsites that has long been used by both through hikers and weekend hikers. In mid-May 1981, the couple disappeared while hiking in that area. Their bodies were later discovered near the trail. Both had been murdered. Local and state authorities treated it as a homicide investigation from the start. The killings drew immediate regional attention because violence of that kind along the Appalachian Trail was rare and deeply unsettling for the hiking community. Investigators soon focused on a man locally named Randall Lee Smith. Smith was from the area and became the primary suspect in the murders. He was arrested and charged in connection with the killings. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to pursue serious charges that could have resulted in a much harsher sentence. Randall Lee Smith was sentenced in 1982 to those 30 years in prison, pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. Despite the 30-year sentence, Smith did not remain incarcerated for the full term. He was released after serving part of his sentence, which, we can get into later. In May 2008, more than 2 decades after the 1981 murders, Smith was accused of shooting 2 men near Dismal Creek, the same general Appalachian Trail corridor where Ramsey and Mountford had been killed. The 2 victims survived. Authorities identified Smith as a suspect and launched a search. Smith was taken back into custody after a pursuit. Reports indicate that during the encounter, a vehicle was involved and Smith sustained injuries. He was hospitalized and then transferred to jail, and then he died in custody. And that is the end of that story. The Dennis Martin disappearance. In June 1969, the Martin family drove up from Knoxville, Tennessee to spend Father's Day weekend, and this had been planned for a while. Camping in the Smokies was a family tradition for them. On this trip were 6-year-old Dennis Lloyd Martin, his older brother Douglas, their father William Bill Martin, and their grandfather Clyde Martin. Their route was pretty standard. They started in Cades Cove, hiked up to Russell Field and camped, then continued to Spence Field, a grassy bald near the Appalachian Trail where they planned to spend another night. Spence Field is high, open, surrounded by steep forested slopes and drainages. It's not far off the AT or Appalachian Trail, but once you drop off the open field into the trees, the terrain gets rough fast. Ravines, laurel thickets, and dense undergrowth. On June 14th, 1969, the second day of their trip, the Martins reached Spence Field. They met another Knoxville family along the way, the Key family, and their kids started playing together. The boys decided to prank the adults. They would split up, circle around, and jump out to scare the grown-ups walking along the trail. The other children moved off to one side. Dennis, who was smaller, was told to hide closer, behind a bush at the edge of the field. Bill Martin watched this happen. He saw the other kids crouched and hiding, but he noticed something. He couldn't see Dennis anymore. A few minutes went by. The other boys ran out, laughing and shouting as planned. Dennis didn't. His father waited, expecting him to pop out late or from a slightly different spot. When he didn't appear after a few minutes, Bill started to feel that something was wrong. The first instinct was to look close. Bill and the family combed the immediate area around the bushes and the edge of the field, calling his name. When that failed, Bill made a call. He started running down the trail. He reportedly ran for about 2 miles, reasoning that if Dennis had wandered in that direction, he would have time to get only so far in the few minutes since he'd last been seen. Bill didn't see any sign of him on that run though. He turned back. By now, it had been long enough that this wasn't just a kid hiding a little too well. The Martins and other hikers expanded the informal search, but as afternoon dragged on with no sign, they knew they needed help. Rangers were notified a few hours after Dennis vanished, and an organized search began that evening. The conditions that night were bad. Around dusk, heavy rain moved in over the mountains. Roughly 3 inches of rain fell in a few hours, temperatures dropped into the low 50s in Fahrenheit, and fog and low cloud cover settled in. For a 6-year-old in a red t-shirt, shorts, and shoes exposed on a high ridge with no shelter, that's a very serious survival problem. Hypothermia, disorientation, and limited visibility all at once. The rain also meant something else for the investigation. It meant that whatever tracks or small clues might have been near Spence Field were getting hammered by water and runoff on the very first night. Very unfortunate. By the next day, the search had turned into a full-scale operation. Rangers called in extra personnel. Over the following days, the effort grew into the largest search in the history of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Roughly 1,400 people at its peak, covering around 56 square miles of rugged terrain. That group included park rangers, local volunteers, National Guard units, and even Green Beret Special Forces teams brought in to search the steep drainages and the off-trail slopes. Searchers worked grids, followed creeks and ridge lines, and checked blowdowns, sinkholes, and dense thickets. Helicopters scanned from above when weather allowed. The area around Spence Field drops off hard on multiple sides, and the teams tried to account for the possibility that Dennis might have slipped, fallen into a drainage, or followed a creek downhill. Despite the size of the search and the number of trained people involved, they found no confirmed trace of Dennis. No clothing, no body, and no clear track that everyone agreed was his. As the days went on, search leaders had to balance continued effort with safety and practicality. The operation ran at full intensity for nearly 2 weeks. By June 22nd, about 56 square miles had been searched. Eventually, the number of searchers was reduced. On June 26th, the search was significantly scaled back, and on June 29th, a last major push took place. The case wasn't closed at that point, but the phase of massive daily searching was over. The search was officially suspended on September 14th, 1969. More than 50 years later, there is still no definitive physical evidence of what happened to Dennis. Once you get past that day-to-day search narrative, the Dennis Martin case becomes a clusterfuck of specific details and competing theories that people have argued about for decades. One of the biggest points of debate is the footprints. During the search, trackers found a set of child-sized tracks in the area. They went from soft ground toward a stream and then disappeared at the water. The key detail is how they were described. According to park documents and later summaries, the prints showed one barefoot and one foot wearing a shoe, an Oxford-style shoe or a tennis shoe, the same type of shoe Dennis had been wearing. At the time, park officials dismissed these as likely belonging to a Boy Scout involved in the search. There were scouts in the area helping, and the rangers decided that the footprints didn't belong to Dennis. But retired Smokies Ranger Dwight McCarter, who later wrote about the case and is widely respected as a backcountry tracker, has said that he believes those tracks were probably Dennis's. His reasoning was that the prints appeared alone and not as part of a group, and the pattern of it being barefoot on one foot and shoe on the other. Dwight McCarter argued that this doesn't match how a search team or a scout group would normally move. The next big piece you see in almost every deep dive on this case is the Harold Key sighting. Harold and his family from Carthage, Tennessee, or Carthage, Tennessee, were reportedly in the park that same day in a different area near Rowan's Creek. They heard what they thought was a scream. A little later, Harold's son pointed out what he first thought was a bear. Harold looked closer and said he saw a rough-looking, shaggy man, quote-unquote, moving through the woods, apparently trying to stay out of sight, carrying something over his shoulder that looked like cloth or clothing and was red, the same color as Dennis's t-shirt. Now, we have to be careful here. Distance matters here. The Key sighting, Harold Key, was around 5 miles from Spence Field, closer to 7 or 9 miles by trail. The timing Harold later reported had the scream and the shaggy man roughly an hour after Dennis disappeared. Park rangers and the FBI eventually concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to firmly connect the sighting to Dennis's disappearance, given the distance and the terrain someone would have to cover in that amount of time. But the way that information was handled actually added fuel later. The Martin family was not told about the Key sighting right away. When they learned of it later, Bill Martin became convinced the case might involve abduction, not just a child lost to exposure, and he was frustrated that it hadn't been pursued more aggressively at the time. Years later, another piece entered the story: the ginseng hunter claim. An illegal ginseng digger reportedly told authorities that in the early 1980s, he had found a small human skeleton and a child's shoes in a remote area of the park, but he didn't report it at the time because he didn't want to expose his own poaching. That's crazy. When he finally came forward years later, a search of the location he described turned up nothing. There's no confirmed physical evidence that ties his story to Dennis, but the claim keeps getting mentioned because it's one of the only "I found remains" stories connected to the case. Officially, investigators have stayed within 3 main lanes of theory. The first one is lost and exposure. This is the most straightforward explanation. Dennis got turned around after his prank, dropped off the field into rough terrain, and succumbed to exposure or injury. The storm that night, the temperature drop, and how fast a small child can become hypothermic all support this as the National Park Service's primary working theory. The idea is that his body ended up in a place that searchers just missed, like thick laurel, a crevice, deep blowdown, or it was later moved by animals. The second lane here is animal predation. Black bears, feral hogs, bobcats, and copperheads are present around Spence Field. Some have suggested that a bear or a hog could have grabbed him and carried him downhill. There's no direct evidence of an animal attack, no blood or any scraps of clothing, but given the wildfire and terrain, it's one of the possibilities park staff have had to keep on the table. The third lane of theory is abduction by a human. This is where the Harold Key sighting comes in. Bill Martin leaned toward this explanation, especially after learning about the shaggy man with something red over his shoulder. The FBI and NPS never formally said this was definitely a kidnapping, but they also couldn't completely rule it out. They just stated that the available evidence was not strong enough to connect any specific person to the disappearance. Outside of official reports, there's another layer that I should mention. It's the wild man or feral people layer. This is something that came up in a lot of online discussions and around Appalachian lore. Locals and internet communities have built a whole sub-myth around the idea that Dennis was taken by some isolated wild man or group living deep in the Smokies, and that the Green Berets were brought in not just to search, but to hunt those people down. That angle shows up in Reddit threads and podcasts and YouTube videos and that kind of thing, but it's not really supported by any actual official documentation. It's just speculation and folk storytelling on top of a real unsolved disappearance. What is solidly documented are the numbers and impact. The search for Dennis cost an estimated $2,549,000. That's crazy. It involved around 1,400 searchers and it covered more than 56 square miles. It's still described by the park as the largest search effort in Great Smoky Mountains history. There were a lot of volunteers and a lot of searchers, but for the Martin family, it never really ended. Bill Martin continued to search and talk publicly about the case for years. It's really sad. Trenny Gibson disappearance. On Friday, October 8th, 1976, 16-year-old Teresa Trini Lynn Gibson left Bearden High School in Knoxville, Tennessee on what was supposed to be a simple horticulture field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. She was a quiet, good student, 5'3", about 115 pounds, with brown hair and green eyes. That day she wore a blue blouse, a blue and white striped sweater, jeans, blue Adidas shoes, and a heavy brown plaid jacket that she'd borrowed from a classmate. The trip was led by horticulture teacher Wayne Dunlap. Around 38 or 40 students boarded the bus that morning. Dunlap hadn't told them the destination ahead of time. Multiple write-ups say he wanted it to be a surprise. The bus left Knoxville around 9 a.m. and drove to the Clingman's Dome area of the park, one of the highest points in the Smokies, with an observation tower and several popular trails branching off. The plan was that the group would park near Clingman's Dome, hike the Forney Ridge Trail out to Andrews Bald, look at plants and trees, and then come back the same way. Dunlap reportedly gave specific instructions. Don't take side trails, don't go past Andrews Bald, don't pick or damage vegetation, and to be back at the bus by 3:30. After a show of hands that everyone understood, the kids set off. It was chilly, overcast, and breezy on the ridge that day. Several sources describe the weather as cool with some fog and low clouds, typical for the high Smokies in October, but enough to make the forest darker and the trail edges feel a little more precarious. As they hiked, the students naturally broke into smaller groups based on pace. According to accounts, Trini didn't stay with just one group, she moved between groups and at different times walked with various classmates. For much of the hike toward Andrews Bald, she was with Robert Simpson, the friend whose jacket she was wearing. They reached the Bald, spent some time there, and around 1:30 p.m., Trini left ahead of Robert and started back toward the parking area on her own. On the return leg, she was seen by other students along Forney Ridge Trail, which in that section is described as moderately steep with sharp drop-offs and dense undergrowth on both sides. People behind her on the trail later reported seeing her up ahead walking alone. In one widely repeated summary of student interviews, classmates said that they saw her bend down or step off the trail to the right, just for a moment. When they looked again, she was gone. By about 3 p.m., Trini's last confirmed sighting placed her somewhere between Andrews Bald and the Clingman's Dome parking lot, on that same narrow, brush-lined trail. When the groups drifted back to the bus near the scheduled meetup time, people started to realize that she wasn't there. Some students assumed she was with another cluster or had gone ahead. As minutes passed and she still hadn't shown up, concern turned into anxiety. Dunlap and some of the kids checked obvious spots first. They reportedly looked around the parking area, the nearby observation tower, and restrooms, but there was no sign of her. The teacher eventually contacted park rangers. Exactly how the formal response began varies a bit by source, but by late afternoon or early evening, Great Smoky Mountains National Park staff were aware that they had a missing 16-year-old on their hands. Rangers began an initial search that evening along the trail and in the surrounding woods, but they were up against time and conditions. Fading daylight, cooling temperatures, and the usual Smokies fog and cloud cover setting in along the high ridges. They had a last known window around 3 p.m. on the Forney Ridge Trail and an approximate area, but no clear direction. Once park rangers realized Trini wasn't just lagging behind, they escalated pretty fast. Over the days that followed, search teams spread out from Forney Ridge Trail, Andrews Bald, and the Clingman's Dome parking area. They brought in tracking dogs, closed sections of road to the public, and used aircraft when the weather allowed. Her parents came up to the park and provided pieces of her clothing from home so the dogs could lock onto her scent. Multiple dogs on different days picked up that scent where the Forney Ridge Trail meets the Appalachian Trail near the search zone. From there, handlers said the dog followed it past the Clingman's Dome tower area and then down toward the road in the direction of Newfound Gap. Eventually, the trail ended about 1.5 miles from Newfound Gap, near a roadside pull-off. A detail that's shown up repeatedly in later research is that searchers reportedly found a partially opened beer can, and 3 cigarette butts near the spot where Trini was seen stepping off the trail. Later, at the roadside location where the dogs lost the scent, they found more cigarette butts of the same brand. None of the classmates admitted bringing beer or cigarettes, and Trini was not known to smoke. So her scent leading to the road, plus signs that someone else had been hanging around in at least 2 different spots, fueled some abduction theories for a while. The search conditions really weren't easy. The Smokies are steep, full of sinkholes, blowdowns, dense rhododendron and laurel hells with deep ravines. Fog and intermittent bad weather limited the air support early on. Rangers closed the Klingman's Dome Road between the dome and Newfound Gap during the heaviest searching. At night, teams had to weigh safety against the need to keep looking. It was pretty serious. Despite all of that, the search produced 0 confirmed physical evidence of Trini. This is really a theme this video. I didn't even plan this. I feel like I'm repeating myself. They found nothing of her. By the end of October 1976, the official search was suspended. The case remained open, but active searching wound down. From there, everything splits into theories. Officially, sources like the Charlie Project and Doe Network classify her as lost/injured missing, meaning the default assumption in records is that she became lost or injured in the park and was never recovered. And now, outside of those formal labels, like just getting down to the real talk, there are 4 main narrative lanes with this one. First of all is, again, lost, fall, exposure, that kind of thing. In this version, Trini steps off the trail, maybe to look at something or to avoid other hikers, slips on a steep slope, and falls into thick brush or a ravine. Given the drop-offs and dense undergrowth in that section, it's possible for someone to be concealed from view just a short distance off trail. With October temperatures and rough terrain, she could have died of injuries and exposure before help ever reached her, and searchers just simply never found the body. This is the simplest explanation, and it lines up with how the park tends to categorize her case. The second lane, or second idea narrative, is abduction by a stranger. The scent trail that appears to lead from the trail junction past the tower and down to a roadside pull-off, plus the cigarette butts and beer can, is what keeps this abduction theory alive. Some versions of the story imagine a person waiting off trail watching students go by and intercepting Trini when she stepped off the path. In that scenario, she might have been held somewhere near the tower area until her classmates left, and then walked or carried through the woods to the road and driven away. It's important to say that this idea comes from how private researchers and some former rangers interpret the scent dog reports and a few physical clues, but it doesn't come from any named arrested suspect. No one's been charged with this. It's just a theory, and it's not one that the cops really went with. The third narrative is foul play by someone she knew. This is where things get more speculative and more personal. Trini's family voiced concerns over the years about people in her social orbit, including a young man named Kelvin Bowman, who had previously been shot in the foot by Trini's mother during an attempted break-in at their home and allegedly made threats afterward. Some online discussions also fixate on Robert Simpson, the classmate whose jacket she was wearing and who she walked with for most of the day, pointing to his proximity to her and later behavior around the family. There's no public record of charges against either of them in connection with her disappearance. These theories mostly live in books, blogs, and podcasts, and message boards, that kind of thing. So this is also one that didn't really formally get looked at. And then the fourth one is runaway or voluntary disappearance. Some investigators at the time briefly considered the idea that Trini might have run away. She was 16, and there are suggestions in some reporting that her home life may not have been ideal. But there's nothing solid showing that she planned to disappear or had money, contacts, or any kind of destination lined up. She left behind all the usual things that runaways tend to take. There was no packed bag, there was no stash of cash and no note, vanishing in the middle of a supervised school trip with no clear way off the mountain except by hiking miles out or meeting a car at a specific pull-off. makes this theory really hard to square with any logistics. And then on top of those, you've got the more out there stuff like Bigfoot and feral people or portals showing up in FOIA requests and paranormal blogs. The National Park Service FOIA log even shows someone requesting documents about Trini and another missing hiker, quote, associated with a possible Bigfoot abduction, which tells you how far the case has spread into weird internet territory. Her father, siblings, and several people who searched for her since have died. A tree and plaque at Bearden High School honor her, and there are age-progressed images showing what she might look like today. Websites like the Charlie Project, dedicated blogs, and local TV projects like Appalachian Unsolved keep revisiting the case, but officially she is still listed as missing, presumed lost or injured in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Sodder children. On Christmas Eve 1945, George and Jenny Sodder were at home near Fayetteville, West Virginia, with 9 of their 10 children. The Sodders were an Italian-American family. George had immigrated from Tula, Sardinia, and built a decent life running a trucking and coal hauling business. One thing that people point out about this case that I need to bring up for context is that George was very outspoken against Mussolini and fascist Italy, and he'd gotten into arguments about it with other Italian immigrants in the area. And that detail matters because in the months before the event we're going to talk about, there were a couple of weird incidents. A life insurance salesman who'd been turned down reportedly told George that his house would, quote, go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of his anti-Mussolini comments. Another man came to the house asking about work and pointed to the fuse box, saying this will cause a fire someday. That stood out because George had recently had the wiring checked and passed by the power company. Now, back to Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve itself started normally. The Sodders' oldest daughter, Marion, came home from her job at a dime store with presents for some of the younger kids. The younger ones were excited and begged to stay up late. Around 10 p.m., Jenny agreed as long as 14-year-old Maurice and 10-year-old Louis remembered to bring in the cows and feed the chickens before bed. Remember, this was 1945. George and some of the older boys went to sleep. Jenny took 3-year-old Sylvia upstairs and went to bed as well. At around 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny got up and answered it. A woman's voice she didn't recognize asked for a name Jenny didn't know. Jenny later said she could hear clinking glasses and laughter in the background, and the caller let out a strange laugh before hanging up. When Jenny put the phone down, she noticed the lights were still on and the curtains not drawn downstairs. Things the older kids usually did before bed. Marion was asleep on the couch, so Jenny assumed the other younger children had gone up to the attic where they slept. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and went back to bed. At around 1 a.m., Jenny heard a loud bang on the roof and then a rolling sound. She didn't see anything outside and eventually went back to sleep. About 30 minutes later, she woke again, this time smelling smoke. She got up and found that George's office room was on fire around the fuse box and phone line. She woke George and he woke the older boys. The house, largely wood, started to go fast. Jenny and George managed to get Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. out of the house. The other 5 children, Maurice, aged 14, Martha 12, Louis 10, Jenny 8, and Betty 5, were believed to be in the upstairs bedroom. The staircase was already engulfed, they couldn't reach them that way. George tried to break a window to get in from outside, and he badly cut his arm. They tried to use the ladder that normally leaned against the side of the house to climb to the attic window, but it was gone. It was later found thrown down an embankment away from the house. There was a water barrel they sometimes used for emergencies, but that night it was frozen solid. George then tried to drive 2 of his work trucks up to the house and to use them like makeshift ladders, but in the chaos, neither truck would start, despite having run fine the day before. At this point, all they could do was stand outside with the 4 surviving kids and watch the house burn. The structure reportedly collapsed in about 45 minutes. Calling for help turned into its own mess. The Sodders' house phone line was dead. Marion ran to a neighbor's home to call the fire department, and another motorist who'd seen the fire also tried from a nearby tavern. In both cases, they had trouble reaching the operator. Eventually, a call made it through from a phone in town. The Fayetteville Fire Department was a small volunteer outfit. The chief, F.J. Morris, didn't even drive the truck himself, so they had to round up a driver and volunteers one by one. The crew didn't arrive until early that morning, several hours after the fire. At around 10 a.m., firefighters and family were sifting through the ashes in what was basically the burned-out basement. Chief Morris told the Sodders that no remains had been found, even though 5 children were believed to have died in the blaze. In other accounts, there's a claim that small bone fragments or internal organs were found but not shown to the family. Modern fire professionals have said the search done that day was brief and not especially thorough. Either way, the official conclusion was that the 5 missing children died in the fire, and the heat was intense enough to fully consume their remains. So sad. On December 30th, 1945, local authorities issued death certificates for all 5 missing children, listing the cause as fire or suffocation. The fire was officially blamed on faulty wiring, despite George's insistence that the system had been recently inspected. The Sodders didn't rebuild. Within days, George bulldozed what remained of the house, covered it with about 5 feet of dirt, and turned the site into a small memorial garden for the missing kids. Jenny would tend that spot for decades, and while the state considered the matter closed, George and Jenny were already convinced that something about that night didn't add up. One of Jenny's first questions was bones. A local crematorium worker told her that even when bodies are burned at around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, bones remain. A human skeleton doesn't just disappear. Their house had burned for roughly 45 minutes before collapsing. Jenny did her own experiments, burning small piles of animal bones and watching what happened. She always had solid fragments left. That made it very hard for her to accept that 5 children's bodies could be completely destroyed in such a short house fire. There were other details too. The ladder that should have been leaning against the house turned up in that ditch away from the home. The phone line, originally said to have been burned in the fire, appears to have actually been cut at the pole. Both of George's trucks failing at the same time after working fine the previous day also struck him as suspicious. In the weeks after, a bus driver reported that on Christmas Eve he had seen people throwing what looked like balls of fire at the Sodder house. Months later, when snow melted, Sylvia, the youngest, found a small, hard, dark green rubber object in the yard. George thought it looked like some kind of incendiary grenade, similar to a pineapple-style device used in wartime. Jenny remembered the bang on the roof before the fire and wondered if that is what she had heard. Then there were the sightings. A woman watching the fire from the road said that she saw some of the Sodder children looking out of a car window as it drove away during the blaze. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed that she served breakfast to 5 children the next morning, accompanied by adults, and noted a car with Florida plates. A hotel operator in Charleston later said that she'd seen the 5 children about a week after the fire, with no men and 2 women of, quote, Italian extraction. None of these sightings were ever confirmed, but they fed the family's belief that the kids had been taken, not killed. The Sodders hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, from nearby Gauley Bridge. He discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George over his anti-Mussolini views had somehow ended up on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. He also heard rumors that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had actually found some kind of heart in the ashes and hidden it in a metal box. When confronted, Morris led George and Tinsley to the spot where he'd allegedly burned the box. Inside was a lump of tissue. A local funeral director examined it and said it wasn't a heart at all. It was fresh beef liver that had never been burned. Later rumors claimed Morris admitted he'd planted the liver, hoping the family would accept it as evidence and stop digging into the case. In 1949, the Sodders pushed for a more serious excavation of the site. A Washington, D.C. pathologist examined material from the basement and found 4 lumbar vertebrae, bones from a human spine. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution. Their analysis was that the vertebrae likely came from someone 16 to 22 years old, older than the Sodder children. The oldest missing, Maurice, was 14. The bones showed no signs of fire damage. The Smithsonian report concluded that the bones were probably part of the fill dirt that George had used to level the basement and not remains from the fire, and said that if 5 children had died in that blaze, you'd expect to recover far more skeletal material than just 4 vertebrae. With official channels basically done, the Sodders turned to the public. They printed flyers and, in the early 1950s, put up a huge billboard along the road by their property and another along US Route 60. The sign had the 5 children's photos, the story, and a reward, eventually up to $10,000, for any information. It became a local landmark on what is now West Virginia Route 16 and stayed up until 1989. Shortly after Jenny died. Leads continued to trickle in. In the 1960s, the family received a photo in the mail of a young man in his 20s. The back was scribbled with Louis Sodder and a few cryptic lines. George and Jenny believed the man looked like an older version of their missing son. They hired more detectives, but nothing concrete came from it. Over time, the case turned into exactly the kind of long-running Appalachian mystery that ends up in videos and books. The family's working theory was that the children had been abducted, possibly by people tied to the Sicilian mafia, either to punish George for his politics or to extort money. In that scenario, someone set the house on fire as cover and others took the children out beforehand. The idea that they might have been smuggled back to Italy shows up a lot in later family interviews. On the other side, some modern writers leaned more toward a more mundane explanation. The kids really did die in the fire, and between the coal-fired basement, the intensity and location of the burn, and a rushed, imperfect search in 1945, their remains were either destroyed or missed. The Smithsonian bone analysis doesn't prove they survived, it just proves that those particular bones weren't theirs. George died in 1968, still convinced his children had been taken. Jenny wore black and tended the memorial garden for the rest of her life. She died in 1989, the same year the famous billboard finally came down. Their surviving children and grandchildren kept pushing the story, giving interviews and maintaining interest online. The youngest, Sylvia, who had been 3 at the time of the fire, spent her life saying she believed her siblings survived that night, and that she felt obligated to keep the case alive. I don't know, guys. What do you think? Let me know. This one is so sad. The Greenbrier Ghost. If you zoom in on a map of the central Appalachians and follow the ridges through southeastern West Virginia, you eventually land in Greenbrier County. Rolling hills, small farms, and little churches tucked into hollows. In the late 1800s, this area was still very rural, very church-driven, and very superstitious. And that is the background for one of the strangest murder cases in Appalachian history, the story of Elva Zona Heister Shue, better known as the Greenbrier Ghost. Zona Heister was born around 1873 and grew up near Richlands in Greenbrier County. By 1896, she was a young woman with a child out of wedlock, living with her family in a community where reputation mattered. In October of that year, a blacksmith named Edward Stribling Trout Shue arrived in the county and took work at a local shop owned by James Crookshanks. He went by Trout or Edward, and he made an impression. He was well-dressed, charming, and very focused on finding a wife quickly. Zona met him soon after he came to town, and within a short time they were married, despite her mother, Mary Jane Heister, openly disliking him from the start. For a few months, nothing outwardly dramatic happened. Some accounts say Zona had been ill that winter and was under the care of Dr. George Knapp for, quote, female troubles. God, it's crazy how misogynistic the world used to be. But we think that that may have meant a possible pregnancy or miscarriage, but that's not confirmed. On January 23, 1897, a cold Saturday in the middle of the Appalachian winter, Trout Shue went to the nearby home of Aunt Martha Jones and asked if her 11-year-old son, Andy Jones, could come to the house and do some chores and run an errand for Zona. Andy walked to the small log house where the Shoes lived. When he went inside, he found Zona lying at the foot of the stairs, stretched out on the floor with her feet together, one hand across her stomach and her head tilted to one side. He was so frightened he ran back home to tell his mother, who then sent for the doctor and local authorities. Dr. Knapp didn't reach the house for about an hour. By the time he arrived, Trout had already carried Zona's body upstairs to the bedroom and laid her out on the bed. He had washed and dressed her himself, something that the women in the community usually did, and he put her in a high-necked dress with a stiff collar and a veil over her face. That was unusual enough on its own, but his behavior on top of that really stood out. He stayed pressed right up against the body, cradling her head, crying loudly and fussing with the scarf and pillows under her neck while the doctor tried to examine her. Dr. Knapp noted some bruising or discoloration around her neck, but whenever he tried to get a better look, Trout became agitated, sobbed harder, and shifted her head in his arms. Between the grief display and the cultural norms of the time, Knapp eventually backed off. He did only a cursory exam and recorded the cause of death as everlasting faint, basically a vague Victorian term for sudden collapse, and later amended it to complications of pregnancy. Zona's body was taken back to her family home in the Richlands area. During the wake, Trout insisted on keeping a scarf tied tightly around her neck and propped her head with pillows and a rolled-up cloth. He claimed the scarf was her favorite and he wanted her buried in it. Neighbors later said he became visibly upset if anyone got too close to her head or tried to adjust the scarf or pillows. Her mother, Mary Jane, watched all of this. She already disliked Trout. She had protested the marriage and had a bad feeling about him from the beginning. Now her daughter was suddenly dead, the doctor hadn't really examined her, and the husband seemed almost obsessed with protecting her neck from scrutiny. When the family tried to pay their last respects, Mary Jane later said that she had felt something wrong in the room. She described it as a chill sense that the body was not at peace. Zona was buried in a little cemetery near Soul Chapel, just a short drive off of what would later become US Route 60 through the Greenbrier Valley. On paper, the case was finished. You had a young woman in the mountains who had died of natural causes. But Mary Jane refused to accept it. She went home, took down a sheet from the line and spread it out on her bed, a piece of funeral fabric that had been touching Zona's body, and according to her, it changed color and seemed to hold a stain that she couldn't watch out. That, and that combined with everything she'd seen at the wake, convinced her that her daughter had been murdered. So she did what a lot of Appalachian mothers do in stories, but very few do in real life. She started praying and asking her daughter to come back and tell her the truth. According to Mary Jane Heaster, her prayers were answered. She later testified that for 4 nights in a row, Zona's spirit came to her. At first, it appeared in her room as a bright light that gradually took on the shape of her daughter, bringing with it a deep, unnatural cold. On one of those nights, Mary Jane said the figure sat at the foot of her bed and told her exactly what happened. Zona's ghost, in her mother's account, said this: her husband, Trout Shoe, was a violent man who abused her. On the day she died, he came home angry because he thought she hadn't cooked meat for supper. During the argument, he grabbed her by the throat and snapped her neck. To prove it, the apparition supposedly turned its head all the way around until it was facing backward. Armed with this story, Mary Jane went to the prosecuting attorney, John Alfred Preston, in Lewisburg and spent hours in his office. Whether Preston believed the ghost story personally doesn't show up in the record, but he was bothered by how little real medical examination had taken place. There were also rumors in the community that Trout had behaved oddly and that people suspected foul play. Preston decided there was enough concern to reopen things. He sent deputies to re-interview witnesses and went himself to talk to Dr. Knapp, who admitted he had not done a full exam. That alone gave Preston the legal opening he needed. He requested that Zona's body be exhumed for a proper autopsy, and a local inquest jury was assembled. On February 22, 1897, less than a month after the burial, Zona's body was dug up and taken to a nearby one-room schoolhouse for the autopsy. 3 doctors, including Knapp, examined her. The autopsy reportedly lasted about 3 hours. What they found lined up with what Mary Jane said the ghost had described. According to contemporary accounts and a later published report, her neck was broken between the first and second vertebra, her windpipe was crushed, and there were clear signs of violence. Finger marks on the throat, torn ligaments, and damage to the front of the neck. This was definitely not just someone falling down the stairs. At that point, Trout Shue was charged and arrested with murder. While he sat in jail in Lewisburg waiting for trial, more of his background came out. He had been married twice before. One wife had divorced him and accused him of extreme cruelty, and another had died under suspicious circumstances less than a day after they married. People also recalled how he talked about wanting to have 7 wives. Zona was his third. The trial began on June 22, 1897, in Greenbrier County. Preston, the prosecutor, kept his questioning grounded. He was questioning about cause of death, the autopsy findings, Trout's behavior, his history. He didn't try to build a legal case around ghost testimony or anything like that. The ghost story definitely made it in the courtroom, but in more of a sideways way. The defense attorney, hoping to paint Mary Jane as unreliable or unbalanced, cross-examined her about supposed visits from Zona's spirit, expecting her story to sound ridiculous and to shake her credibility. The plan backfired. By all accounts, Mary Jane stayed calm and completely consistent. She repeated the same details she had told Preston. She insisted she had seen and heard her daughter and that the story was real. Because the defense had brought it up, the judge had limited ability to tell the jury to ignore it. In a heavily religious mountain community where belief in visions and signs was already baked into culture, her testimony landed harder than the lawyer expected. Even so, when you strip the legend back to the court record, the conviction rested on physical evidence and Trout's behavior. The autopsy proved Zona died from manual strangulation and a broken neck. Trout had interfered with the initial exam, had a suspicious marital history, and couldn't offer a believable alternative explanation. After hearing all of this, the jury deliberated and found him guilty of first-degree murder, recommending mercy. The judge sentenced him to life in prison at the state penitentiary in Moundsville in the northern West Virginia panhandle, still part of the Appalachian system. Not long after, a small lynch mob formed and tried to take him from the jail, but the sheriff dispersed them before they reached him. Trout Shue died a few years later on March 13th, 1900 in prison during an epidemic, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. Greenbrier County didn't really want to let this story fade, though. In the 1990s, the state put up an official West Virginia historical marker near Soul Chapel Methodist Cemetery where Zona is buried. The text on it reads, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother and described how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murder." What a crazy sign. I am glad that her killer found justice and was put to justice, you know. Sad that people died. This is not good, but I'm glad that justice was made. Do you guys think the ghost was real or not? I really don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. Brown Mountain Lights. I'm in North Carolina and I love Western North Carolina. This is actually the thing that made me want to make this video. If you drive out into the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western North Carolina, east of the main tourist strip in Asheville, you eventually hit a low tree-covered ridge called Brown Mountain. It sits in Burke County on the edge of Pisgah National Forest, looking over the Linville Gorge and the foothills that lead down out of the southern Appalachians. On clear nights, people have been going up to overlooks along NC Highway 181 and the Blue Ridge Parkway for over a century to watch for something that shouldn't really be there. Glowing, drifting lights that seem to rise above the dark outline of the mountain, hang there, and then fade. These are the Brown Mountain Lights. So, people describe small, bright orbs, usually white, yellow, or reddish, appearing above the ridgeline. Sometimes they seem to move horizontally, sometimes they float up and disappear. They don't always show up and they don't follow a perfect schedule. On some nights, multiple lights are seen at once. On others, nothing happens at all. The most common viewing spots are the Brown Mountain Overlook on NC 181 between mile markers 20 and 21, the Lost Cove and Green Mountain overlooks on the Parkway, and Wiseman's View above Linville Gorge. All of these are pull-offs or short walks where you look across a broad valley toward Brown Mountain and the surrounding Appalachian ridges. The first published reports of mysterious lights over Brown Mountain date back to the early 1910s. A 1913 piece in the Charlotte Daily Observer talked about red lights appearing punctually above the horizon at set times in the evening. Locals started writing to politicians asking for an investigation, and the whole thing snowballed into a minor regional mystery. That same era is when electricity and rail traffic were expanding into the western North Carolina mountains. The Southern Railway had trains running through the Morganton area, and new, extremely bright locomotive headlights, rated around 600,000 candle power, were being installed just a few years before the earliest newspaper mentions of the lights. At the same time, more and more towns and industrial sites down in the valleys were getting electric lights. Researchers who have gone back through travelogues and local histories have pointed out that no one mentioned the Brown Mountain lights in print before about 1910, even though lots of people were writing about odd and supernatural things in the area. Because the stories wouldn't die, the U.S. Geological Survey got pulled in. In 1913, geologist D.B. Sterrett came to the area to check it out. Standing at the famous Lovin's Hotel vantage point, he mapped the sight lines and compared them to the Southern Railway tracks and schedules. His conclusion was that a lot of the mysterious lights people were seeing matched the route and timing of train headlights in the valley. But that didn't end it. A 1916 flood washed out tracks and halted train traffic for a while, but people said that they still saw lights. So in 1922, the USGS sent out another scientist, George R. Mansfield, to do a more thorough survey. Mansfield spent weeks in the field with maps and an Alidade telescope, logging when and where lights appeared and what was in those directions. His official report concluded that the lights could be fully accounted for by a combination of distant train headlights, automobile headlights, and brush or campfires, which are all normal light sources refracted and distorted by the complex terrain and atmospheric conditions in the Appalachians. And then, on paper, that should have killed the mystery. A federal scientist came in and did the math and said, basically, these are just lights from human activity bouncing around a mountain valley. And for a while, it did tamp down some of the panic. But it didn't stop the stories. Over the rest of the 20th century, the Brown Mountain lights shifted from like a "what is this problem" into a full-on Appalachian ghost legend. Ballads and campfire tales, TV shows, paranormal books, all turned a technical optical issue into something that really lives alongside a bunch of other mountain horror stories. Once the USGS published its 1922 report, calling the Brown Mountain lights nothing more than train and car headlights and brush fires, you'd think the story would fade. But it went the opposite way. As time passed, storytellers in the region started to backfill the mystery with older origin stories. Native American legends, Civil War ghosts, murdered settlers, lost lovers, all kinds of stuff. A close look at the sources shows that many of these tales only show up in print decades after the first newspaper reports, but they've become part of the standard Appalachian lore around the lights. One popular thread says the lights are Native women searching for their dead warriors on the battlefield. Another claims that they're the ghost of an enslaved man wandering the mountains with a lantern, still looking for the master he lost, which is, I don't know, man, I don't like that one. Feels a bit dated. Another version casts them as settler women roaming the ridge in grief. These stories layer very human tragedy onto what might just be distant headlights, which is exactly how a lot of Appalachian ghost lore works. If you want to hear more about these stories, like more in depth, I'd recommend the Wendigoon video on this. I used to love that guy a lot. He actually went to the Brown Mountain and was there and talked about a lot of these origin stories for it. So if you want something more in depth, you should check that out after this video. Not now, don't click off. But the legend got a big boost in the 20th century from music. In 1961, bluegrass musician Scotty Wiseman wrote The Legend of the Brown Mountain Lights, using a family story about his great uncle Fate Wiseman as a hook. In that version, the light is a lantern carried by a faithful old slave who returns from the grave night after night, searching the mountain for his lost master. The song was recorded by multiple bluegrass and country artists, including the Country Gentlemen and the Kingston Trio, and it pretty much locked the Brown Mountain into a lot of that kind of culture. By the mid to late 1900s, the lights also got pulled into UFO culture. Writer Ralph Lale, who owned a rock shop in the area, claimed that he had contacted aliens on Brown Mountain, traveled with them to Venus, and even kept what he said was a mummified alien body on display. His 1965 self-published book, plus the general rise of UFO interest after World War II, pushed the lights into a different category. From there, Brown Mountain started showing up all over pop culture. An episode of The X-Files called Field Trip used a case of missing hikers in the Brown Mountains as the basis for a parasitic fungus horror story. Paranormal shows like Ancient Aliens and Weird or What have covered the lights. A 2014 horror movie called Alien Abduction marketed itself as being based on a true phenomenon because of these lights. There's a lot that happened around here about this. And then even on the science side, people never really stopped poking at it. In the 2010s, Appalachian State University installed low-light cameras overlooking the Brown Mountain, Linville Gorge area and racked up thousands of hours of footage trying to catch something truly unexplainable. The results were underwhelming for the most part. Lots of just normal lights and stuff, and nothing that really stood out as a repeatable, this breaks physics kind of event. This is one of my favorite, it might be my favorite urban legend. There's so much shit in it. I would love to make a whole video about this if you guys would want. I gotta keep it short here, but if you guys want a whole video on this, let me know and I will go more in depth. Alright guys, I think that makes the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching all this way. This one was truly so much fun to make. I say that so much in my videos, but this one I really loved making. Let me know in the comments what you guys want to see next or your theories about any of these cases. Thank you so much for watching guys. Good night everyone and sweet dreams.